And now I will be happy to present you the content, and we will shortly go to the first part of the webinar. First of all, in order to understand this topic of the webinar, I want to give you a short information of the Science to Policy briefs. So, we as a research project for inclusive education and development cooperation, we started to make these Science to Policy briefs in order to get clear our results of our research, which we made in Guatemala and Malawi, and these Science to Policy briefs, we try to explain it in a short form. So these publications give an overview of the respective fields and include promising practices at the one hand, and at the other hand, information about the research results and activities and concrete recommendations for the practical implementation and development cooperation. And so that's why we started with this webinar, in order to share these contents of the Science to Policy briefs. And that is the first webinar, which you already know. And this webinar will deal with accessibility in inclusive education, or as we named it in our PowerPoint presentation, as you can see, breaking down barriers in school infrastructure to achieve education for all. And this will heavily lead me to present you to our experts, which has dealt with this topic, and who had written the Science to Policy brief concerning accessibility. And before I want to present them, I only want to say that whenever you have a question, please do not post this question during the presentation. Keep it in mind or write it down on a paper, and it would be very supportive if you can post these questions later on after the presentation. That would be very, very helpful, and so we will not disturb our experts during their presentation holding. Okay, so you can see them also in at the camera. We have Professor Dr. Degenhardt and Professor Dr. Schröder from Hamburg, from the University of Hamburg. They are working at the Faculty of Education at the Institute of Special Education, and they dedicated their work to education for learners with blindness and low vision, and also education for learners with learning difficulties. Okay, so I will give the word to them both, and welcome Dr. Schröder and Professor Dr. Degenhardt to our webinar. I'm very happy to have you here. And now go ahead with your presentation, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. And good afternoon to all our participants. We are very glad to have the opportunity to present you some topics and issues from our Science to Policy brief. No doubt key requirements for inclusive education and barrier-free schools are barrier-free school environments. And for that reason, we will start with some remarks on different types of barriers in that context. Our main point is that the principles of universal design can help to remove physical, sensory, and cognitive barriers in the school system and to ensure accessibility, orientation, usability, and safety for schools for all children and adolescents. After explaining some principles of the universal design, we will argue that education policy, development, cooperation, educational science have to support the contextualization process and the adaptation of the universal design approach to the local economic, social, cultural, and religious conditions of the countries of the global south. So we have 3 points: barriers, universal design, and the consequences for inclusive education development. I will start with the topic on barriers. Barriers are usually associated with material obstacles. For example, physical barriers such as fences or walls that hinder or prevent people from following their way. Overcoming these barriers requires at least additional time and or efforts. Moreover, material obstacles have a symbolic character. A fence, however low and easily accessible it may be, clearly has the meaning of no trespassing in all cultural and social contexts. The same information may also be inconvenient by a sign, in which case the obstacle loses its direct physical material meaning as a barrier. Accessibility may furthermore be governed by conventions, requiring people, for instance, to pay admission fees or to prove their membership by presenting a valid membership or ID card. Barriers may thus also be indicative of power relations and hierarchical structures. Barriers can both include and exclude people. They can ensure safety and constitute benefit, while at the same time they may discriminate against people and deny them participation. In the educational context, we will find typical barriers around the world. And the first list you have at the PowerPoint presentation enlists the 10 typical barriers in the educational context, such as lack of funding for education, that means financial barriers, or material conditions, or fiscal frameworks, underfinancing of the educational sector, for example. We also have barriers related on gender or on be member of a minority, and of course poverty and living conditions can also have big influence on the possibility for children to go to school or not. Within the school system, there are also well-known barriers, children, and especially, particularly for children with disabilities, because, for example, they do not possess the intellectual or cognitive capacity the school curriculum is requiring. And another typical barriers or groups, vulnerable groups in the context of schooling are, for example, migrant children, refugees, and of course orphans and the children with special needs. Yes. In the area of special needs education or inclusive education, study are showing that one of the greatest barrier, of course, is in the mind of people. A lot of teachers or a lot of pupils, and parents and politicians, they have a lot of arguments why children with disabilities cannot or should not participate or be in a mainstreaming and common schools, or in the mainstream and common school system, because, for example, they think that the pupils cannot follow the topics the curriculum is requiring, or because they think they do not have the money or will not provide the money to provide and to develop the conditions special children with special needs need to have to be integrated and included in the mainstreaming school system. So, and for all that kind of barriers, we think that within the approach of universal design, we can find a theoretical and empirical and also a very practical perspective to overcome these barriers in the school system. My colleague Sven will now explain something on the universal design approach.
Okay, hello, I'm Sven, and if you look into the results all over the world to break some barriers for inclusive education or for persons with disability, there's one main point. If you focus on assistive devices, if you focused on special solution in infrastructure, in education and whatever, you have a problem, because in the mind of most of the politicians, of the persons in the society, it is a lot of money for a minority. And the result of the last years and the discussion all over the world is you have break the isolated strategy to focus such kind of special assistive devices. And one point to overcome this focusing, to overcome this problem, is the universal design. And the universal design, you can find it also in the United Nations paper about the rights of persons with disability, the convention. There is the definition of universal design, and universal design means the design of products, environments, programs and services to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. That is the first step. The next step is universal design shall not exclude assistive devices for particular groups of persons with disabilities where this is needed. This is two sides of one medal. On the one hand side, universal design is good for all. On the other hand side, it is also possible to give additional assistive devices. And I love one example, a typical example, that these are the tablets. And if you look into the universal design of the tablets, the first biggest important one was from Apple, the iPad. You have the possibility to have zoom, you can change the color, you can change the contrast, you have a voice output and screen reader, you can use video telephony for sign language, you have keyboard shortcuts, whatever. That is the idea of universal design, but it makes no sense to put in all tablets a braille display for persons with blindness. So the important thing is that it's easy to connect a braille display. You can read the braille on this display via Bluetooth with the tablets. So the important thing is the combination of universal design and special solution in assistive devices. Another example, if you look into the public transfer, if you have some expansive buildings at the transfer and you have an elevator, a lot of people say, oh, it's so expensive for only one wheelchair users in the year. But if you look who persons use this elevator, these are persons with bicycles, persons with some baggage, moms and dads, and so on. That is not only for persons with disability, for users for wheelchair. It is comfortable for 100%. So one of the main sentences in this context is an accessible environment is absolutely necessary for 10% of the population, necessary for around 30 or 40%, and comfortable for 100%. So that, I think, that is the main point of discussion, the idea. If you look into the principles of universal design, I can show you, for example, some internet. Here you can find it. If you look for universal design, there are some principles, and you can see, for example, this flexibility in using. I can show you. I use this. No, I can't use it. Okay, you can find point 2 is flexibility in use. You can use it by the right hand and by the left hand. That is the next point. For example, it's tolerance for error and whatever. The history of universal design is a little bit too involved older people, the seniors, and more it is the point to involve persons with disability. The next step is you can transfer the idea of universal design in education, and you can find a lot of theory and practice about the universal design for learning or universal design in education. These are some pages in the internet. You can find more details about these principles. So back. Oh. So if we go back to the question, what are barriers in infrastructure for persons with disability, for students with disability? We have 3 different parts. The first part is the way to school. It makes no sense to have an accessible school and the persons with disability have no possibility to come to the school because of the bad infrastructure, bad ways, and no possibility to use the ways, for example, with wheelchair, or to use public transfer with some problems. The next step, here you can see that the blue part is the infrastructure in the school building, but it's not only the building. You have focused the classroom. You have to think over the sanitary rooms. It is one of the most problem in the South, to have no possibility for persons with disability, for students with disability, to use the sanitary rooms because of the infrastructural problems. You have to use the school canteen, the school yard, also the school admission. It makes no sense that there's no possibility to find the principal of the school or whatever. And the third step is you have to think over the extracurricular learning spaces. For example, the zoo, the politicians in the region, and museum and whatever. So these 3 steps you have to focus. The way to the school, to use the school, and the extracurricular learning space. And if you look for some structure for physical environment, accessibility in physical environment, we prefer to use this cube, because there are 3 dimensions. The first dimension is the aim. of the accessibility. The first step is the availability, then the orientation, for example, in the school, and safety and usability. The next level is the structure of realization in reference to the target groups. It makes a difference in focusing the physical part of accessibility, or the sensory, or the cognitive. So you have to focus these three levels. And the third focus is the structure of anchoring. You have to look for the possibility to using law, to use standards, international standards, national standards. And the next point is you have to focus the knowledge and attitudes of all persons who are involved in such kind of process. So we want to give you some examples. For example, the physical aspects. The first thing is ramps. If you ask some persons what is accessibility, you get the answer that is ramps for wheelchair users. The next point is not only ramps, it is also learning and working places who are possible for wheelchair users. The next is the sensory aspects. The main idea is the principle of two senses. It makes no sense for fire alarm, to have only auditive information. You need auditive and visual information for persons with hearing problems or for persons with blindness or low vision. You need information in braille, you need information in tactile printing. And the third level is the cognitive aspect. If you're using, for example, some pictograms, it makes no sense if the pictograms too complicate to recognize what it means. So you have to ask in every situation, is it possible to understand such kind of pictogram, for example, such kind of text for all persons with disability. So the level of availability, you see the ramps, for example. You can find ramps all over the world, but you have to see the length of one ramp is less than 6 meters, because you need power in the arm to drive on this ramp, and the width is more than 1 meter, because it is too dangerous for the fingers on the right and the left hand side if they are less than 1 meter, and the slope has to be less than 6%. The next is if you look for some information for blind people, for wide, long cane users, you need guiding stripes or guiding lines. And you see some examples on the left-hand side. There are a good example on the right-hand side. That is more labyrinth or whatever. It makes no sense to put some indicators without information. The next point is the orientation in the room, in the school. You need high contrast doors, for example, to find the door. You need raised tactile letters and braille for the information of the room number. And the next point is the usability. For example, if you have a garden, you find the way for wheelchair users to underneath, for example, the table, to use a playing garden and work place and so on. And the safety, that is a point in the idea of universal design. That is not only for persons with blindness and low vision. And if you use, for example, the stair, it is better for all persons who have the information in which point the stair starts and in which point the stairs end. So you need markings on the first and on the last stair. And if you have glazed doors, it is a good information for all persons to have markings on this glazed doors. So that is the idea of safety, and mainly in the point of safety, the idea of universal design. You find this, and the question is, where are some possibility to find more details, to find some figures. On the politician way, there's the United Nations Convention for the Right of Persons with Disability. There are a lot of national laws, and then the next step, there are a lot of law about building regulation. In Germany, you find the Musterbauordnung, and you can find such kind of things in every country. The next step is, on the one hand side, there is the building regulations. On the other hand, there's a reality. So that's why you have to look into the law. For example, you can use the international standardization. And in Germany or in Europe, DIN or the European norm, and there you can find a lot of details and figures. But you have to start with think over the idea, and then the next step is to look for some figures to find the right solution, because it makes no sense to start with discussion about some figures about building ramp. So the last point is how persons are involved. If you look into the situation of traditional schools, you can ask, what is the best way to go to inclusive school, and what are the main steps. And the first step is to have to include the law. You have to discuss with the politician about the law. You have to focus the standards. You have to bring the regional politicians in the situation to understand the standards, to understand that these standards are not only for persons with disability, to understand that to realize such kind of standards in the school environment, it is universal designed. It is comfortable for all students, not only for the students with disability. And the next step, you need a lot of work into develop the knowledge and the attitudes of teachers and of the politicians and of the parents and so on. You need, in this process, you need, on the one hand side, you need experts, for example, in building schools. On the other hand side, you need the civil society, especially persons with disability. You need the circle between experts on the one hand side, politicians, teachers, principals, parents, and persons with disability, and their experience are so important, because if you have a person with a wheelchair or a blind person, he can told, for example, the experience, and he can say it is possible to have such kind of solution in this traditional school building. And it is not only the idea to find an building with all standards. You have to do that step by step, and to make the decision what is the next step, you need, on the one hand side, the experts. On the other hand, you need the civil society. And I think these circle between the law, the standards, and the attitudes of all persons, and to involve experts in the civil society, this is the right way to find an individual way to the inclusive school. That's all for the day. So, these are our email address. If you have some questions tomorrow or whatever, you can use it. And now back to you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and first of all, thank you for you to give us this short presentation, and I guess we could have had a good summary of these aspects, which are very, very large, but I think we could get the point. And now I guess that there are many questions or remarks which you want to share with us as the participants. So if you want to pose a question or remark, just like you can see it on the PowerPoint, or we try to make it. You can just click on the button with the hand, and then we will make it together, and or have the possibility to make it. Okay, there's the first question. I want to give the turn to Yutem Kunar. Perhaps you can, if you can speak loud, you can perhaps introduce yourself just with one sentence where you work and where who you are. Would be nice. You have to press on green if you want to say something now. So
Okay.
Hello.
Hello. Yeah. It was a great presentation, and you have covered almost the aspect related to physical barriers on related to inclusive education, and really nice that you have covered physical aspect as well as technology aspect, and would have been really nice to get a little bit more on attitudinal barrier, but maybe for next time, maybe for the next presentation we'll cover that. One suggestion I wanted to add that, when we talk about technology, especially in India, lots of engineering college are having prototypes of accessible instruments for persons with disabilities, which usually starts with a project and gets over without seeing larger production, or it has various reasons, funding, the number of people who wants to access it. But I think there should be some kind of forum where this kind of accessible materials developed by students of engineering college can be put forward for larger public access. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you want to add something, Mr. Degenhardt and Mr. Schröder, to this question?
We couldn't hear it very well.
Okay, yeah, me too.
Maybe you can give us the question.
It was more a remark.
What remark? Yeah. So, okay.
No, I didn't have any question. I just wanted to make a comment.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for this comment. So we switch on to the next hand, to the next participant. So I will go to. Oh, it's very difficult to read aloud out. It's DP Christina Sharma. So if you want to talk now, you have to put it on green. Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
Hello everyone. Yeah, I want to congratulate professors for giving us the insight of accessibility in terms of inclusive education. We work for.
We cannot hear you very well. Could you go with your loudspeakers a little bit more on top?
Hello.
Hello, a little bit louder.
Hello.
Oh.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a little bit better.
Okay, try it again, please. Okay, try to speak.
Lost on the internet.
We can hear you.
Hello.
Oh,
Okay, we are on here. We can hear you. So just start your question, please. Perhaps you can write your question, and I will go to the next participant, and then we will handle it later on. Thank you. Okay, who's next? It's Mohammed Islam. So go ahead and please click on green.
Yes. Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, actually, we have 3 questions. First one is there any set of standards for inclusive school? The second one is when we talks about barrier-free school, we only talks about children with disabilities. What about the other disadvantaged groups like ultra poor or ethnic groups or children having difficult circumstances, or even children from any minority groups? So what about those issues actually? And the third one is how we can make accessible schools or infrastructure using the localized materials, because sometimes it is difficult to develop some accessible infrastructure with our limited resources. So how we can make best use of local resources to make them accessible, and of course using the principles of universal design guideline. That's all.
Yeah. At first, there can't be a set of standards for inclusive school, because if you focused on physical environment of infrastructure, you can find some standards about physical and about sensory, about cognitive accessibility. So you can find a lot of standards in all these points, different points. So there are a lot of versions of long lists. What is an accessible school? But your third question, what about the local situation? All these lists, long lists, they are focused the possibilities in the country of the north, because they have a long tradition in build some schools, elevators, they need power. And the next point is to realize that in some local in some situation you have no electricity, you have no possibility to build big houses. So you have to, in the first step, you have to understand the idea of accessibility, and then you have to look for the solution involve the possibility in this area. So that's why you can't find a list what is an infrastructure for an inclusive school. You can add some experiences, you can focus some different things, for example, the orientation or the safety. One person here in the chat room, he say the most important thing is emergency management. That's right. That's why you have to focus one question, and then you have to understand the idea that accessibility is not only a question for few people with using wheelchair, or person with autism spectrum, or persons with learning disability. The final idea is to create a school for all. That is the idea of universal design. That is your second question. What is about the other persons with health problems, with disability, or with other cultural background or whatever? our policy brief is focused on the infrastructure, and there are the next policy briefs focused on refugees, for example, and whatever. We are only the first step here. Jetzt schweigen wir.
Sie sagt was.
Okay, thank you very much. We have some some more questions in the chat box, because there's one participant who cannot speak and it doesn't function, so we'll read it out loud. I try to do it. So I will try to get the point. Yeah, I just read it out loud, or because it's very long. Hi, this is Lena GIZ. I am typing my question in case you cannot hear me. Later, as mentioned at the beginning, awareness of the importance of inclusive education is closely linked with the availability of data. I am wondering whether you see any current progress in this area, also in the light of the prominences of inclusive education as part of the new Sustainable Development Goal. Are you aware of any good practice examples around monitoring and inclusive education in the Global South? That was the first question. The second question, okay. Then perhaps we can deal only with the first question, because we haven't so much time left. So what can you say about it?
Well, in the document you will find at least some best practice examples, and I think the research project GIZ was developing in Malawi and Guatemala is a kind of monitoring process, and in that document you can also find how in the policy field or in the education and school sector you can implement discussions on accessibility and inclusive education. But you are right, we do not know or we do not have a lot of monitoring instruments or documents or experiences on how to monitor in a broad way in the inclusive education processes in the Global South. Contrary in the Global North, we do have these kind of instruments. For example, in the city-state of Hamburg, we have a big developing plan for inclusive processes in different fields and areas of public life, as transport system, as school, as social work, and so on. But in the Global South, we couldn't find that large programs. We always find small pilot projects in small areas.
Yeah, because the United Nations Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disability, you can find some state reports. And I think every year they add more and more examples, so you can find also examples from some states in the Global South. In our policy brief there are some remarks for some examples, for example in Uganda. Mm-hmm. And I think if you follow up this process of state reports in the United Nations, you can find examples in more and more cases. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for this answer. I will go to the second question of our participant. That will be as you righteously mentioned, costs is one of the first arguments that are raised by policymakers. The universal design approach carries a lot of potential in that regard. Are you aware of any rigorous cost analysis that can demonstrate the point that a universal design approach is competitive in the sense of costs?
Yeah, I think there's some experience that it's cheaper to invest 5 minutes to thinking about universal design before you build a house, in comparison to have additional things to change in a house. I think that is the main point for discussion in discussion with policymakers. It is no different between the global north and the global south. They have the same problem here in Germany to discuss with, for example, university principals if they build a new house, to think over 5 minutes about accessibility. I think there are some figures in our policy brief. I think only a few % of additional costs if you involved all standards of accessibility in building a new house. It's less than you think in the first thing. I think a lot of policymakers produce a barrier to discuss accessibility if they say it is too expensive. I think that is a question of mind and think of beliefs.
Okay, thank you for this comment, Mr. Degenhardt and Schröder. I will go to the next question to Yutam Kuma. Please click on green now.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah. I can hear you.
Okay. Hi, this is Sachin Riza. I was sharing Uttam Kumar's PC. So the presentation was very good, and I have few questions that is mainly related to inclusive education and focused on mainly education part. Is there any kind of curriculum guidelines, or have you tried to adapt the past curriculum based on persons with disabilities education, or how are you going about with the inclusive education for persons with disability? Is there any principles? Is there any guidelines? Because here in India, we recently worked with the government of India, mainly with the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, which says that it is inclusive education and they provide education for all. So disability persons with children with disability are also included in that scheme. And based on that, we tried to modify the existing curriculum based on the needs of persons with deaf blindness, and the government is the government of India are very keen on adapting the books mainly focused for persons with disability. So is there any kind of thing going on in your place as well? And would be very glad if you could share some kind of guidelines or principles on which you are working currently. Yeah.
Thank you. So, Mr. Degenhardt, Mr. Schröder, I think we have to go ahead a little bit because we are nearly. Okay. Okay. I just commented with my chief that she will give the answer now, and then we could nearly go to the next point of our webinar, because we are nearly running out of time. So I give the word to Stefanie Petrasch.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for your question. As it's more general referring and not only focusing on the topic of barrier-free and accessibility, but there will be a new paper presented probably in 4 to 6 weeks from our project, where we exactly address questions you have asked, especially focusing on curriculum changes on teacher education, and we collected good practices around the world, especially focusing on developing countries. And I think that paper might be interesting for you, and we will definitely send it also to the people registered today for the webinar. And in general, like, I wanted to add, because like what has been said before, that it's very important to change the mindset of people. And I mean, we know that no education is the most expensive thing what we can do. So giving education is like saving costs for the whole life, and this is especially true for children with special needs, because like when they don't have any education, no opportunities to further later on go for employment and so on, they need support for their whole life, and that's the most expensive thing. So we always argument that costs which are there, and there are costs for an inclusive education system, but in the end it will save costs.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephanie. I will just make a suggestion that the persons who have a question and couldn't pose it, you can write these questions in the chat box, and we try during the next time to answer these questions, so that we now can switch to the next point of our webinar presentation. That would be very helpful. But thank you very much for the lot of comments you've got and for your questions. So I want to give you more information about the other webinars which are following. You can see this right now at the PowerPoint. Yes, the next webinar will be held on early childhood education. That will be on 27th of April. The next one will go to the theme of refugees. Sorry, 11th of May, and the third one is on ICT, information and communication technologies, and that will be held on 25th of May, and every date is a Wednesday, and it will go to from 2 p.m. to 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. Of our time in Germany. Okay, and then just to know, you have the possibility to read our Science to Policy brief as a whole. We will send the Science to Policy brief, the PowerPoint presentation, and the link with the recorded webinar to all the participants who have given us their email address. If this is not the case, you can also contact us on this email you can see now, inclusiveeducation@giz.de. And after presenting the film, we give you some time in order to download the documents directly at the end of this webinar, and we will be there a little bit more, and you can download it, or just write to us, and we will try to answer your questions and give you more information. You are welcome to do this. Okay, and now I'm very happy to present you the first at the first time our film which we produced together with the design film office, and that will be dealing with inclusive education and the development cooperation as well. And yeah, you can see it also later on and download it. Okay, let's go ahead.
Going to school is not always taken for granted. For some children, it's a wish that will never be fulfilled, especially in our partner countries of international development cooperation. There, the chance for quality education is poor. For children with disabilities, it equals 0. It's not only children with disabilities that are deprived of their right to education. Refugee children and children from rural areas or indigenous populations are often also excluded from educational opportunities. 58 million children worldwide do not go to school. But the right to education is universal. Development cooperation and inclusive education must go hand in hand. So individual solutions to individual challenges have to be found. Article 24 of the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities and the 4th goal of the Agenda for Sustainable Development give us momentum. It's important to translate research into good practice. Only this way our measures can be successful. On behalf of the BMZ, GIZ already works on concrete implementations. These include teacher training in Malawi, creative teaching methods in Guatemala, and widely accessible school buildings in Lebanon. The realization and evaluation of these initiatives are the starting point for further development of future projects. There are a lot of questions to which we still seek answers. Therefore, continuous development of solutions is particularly important to strengthen the basis for upcoming inclusive educational processes. There are a lot of steps need to be taken. Take them with us.
Okay, many sorry about the technical problems that some of you perhaps couldn't see the film. We try to. It's not online yet, but we try to manage it so that you can see the film later on. We will in a few months we will put it on an. We'll put it at the homepage as well. Yeah, we try to manage it and just write to us at inclusiveeducation@giz.de. Yeah, so now we will give you the possibility to download the Science to Policy brief if you want, and you've got the PowerPoint presentation right now. Okay, sorry, we've got another technical problem. So now I want to tell you that you can download now the Science to Policy brief. You have to click on it with the right mouse pad, and then you can download it. And if it not function, we will send it to you via email later on. Okay, and now I will during your download process, I will just say thank you to all the participants joining us, and especially to Degenhardt and Schröder. Many thanks to your presentation. And yeah, I hope that the webinar was fine of you. in spite of the technical problems we had. But that's normal life. So thank you very much. And yeah, we are staying here a little bit more. So if you have a question or some other remarks, you can pose it next time or maybe at the next webinar. Thank you.